Well, thank you very much, Christine and Andrew, for inviting me. I've really enjoyed the opportunity of going back to this work and thinking about it again. So thank you for that. This paper is about a social movement that both wanted to be popular but also wanted to fundamentally change popular culture and its relationship to a novel, or a sort of novel that also wanted to be popular but is probably one of the least popular, or certainly the least read novels of the 20th century, and that's Finnegan's Wake. So in this paper I want to think through the implications of a rather strange collaboration which took place in the late 1920s and the early 30s. A collaboration which, it seems to me, can tell us something interesting about relations between the reformist impulse established through the period in Britain in various movements and often linked to the rationalising project of modernity and the continued place of occult thinking. The relation between occult beliefs, practices and thinking and a rationalising, scientising modernity has been at the heart of scholarly thinking, scholarly interest in, for example, the histories of spiritualism, late 19th century occult revival, the claims and assumptions of psychical research, and the continued importance of occult thinking through New Age beliefs throughout the 20th century. Much of this work has noted the imbrication of a wide variety of occult practices and beliefs with scientific assumptions. As we've heard already, methods and practices which during the first half of the 20th century, of course, became the privileged model for verification, use of evidence and the substantiation of claims. However, at the same time, as scientific models also became the basis for those disciplines concerned with human society and culture rather than the natural world, what is very often seen in the constructions of, say, anthropology, sociology and psychology is a disavowal of beliefs linked to occult, magical or supranormal views of the world. As in late 19th and early 20th century anthropology, for example, these beliefs and practices formed the objects to be investigated, but were continually disavowed and eschewed in the methods and conceptual bases through and upon which such investigations were carried out by most anthropologists, not all of them. So while many late 19th and early 20th century varieties of occult thinking drew on scientific models, academic disciplines claiming to be scientific were constructing themselves in clear opposition to such occult beliefs and modes of thought. And what the collaboration I want to think about in this paper instances, in contrast, is the way the reformist impulses of such a discipline, linguistics in this case, though ostensibly rooted in the orthodoxies of science, were in the end drawn to and implicated in a particular kind of occult thinking. So in 1929, 2 years after he launched his Orthological Institute in Cambridge for the promotion and dissemination of his international auxiliary language, Basic English, C.K. Ogden, a Cambridge scholar with interest in the classics, philosophy and psychology, as well as in linguistics, began a collaboration with James Joyce. In that year, 1929, Ogden made a recording at his institute of Joyce reading part of the Anna Livia Plurabelle section of the work in progress, which was the name given to Finnegan's Wake before it was finally published in 1939. In the same year, Ogden also wrote an introduction to Tales of Shem and Shaun, a work made up of 3 other sections from the work in progress, and he went on to translate the Anna Livia Plurabelle section into his constructed language, Basic English, and the translation was published in his journal, Psyche, in 1931. Now, what's strange about this collaboration is that the invented languages of Ogden and Joyce would seem to be absolute opposites. Basic English, BASIC standing for British American Scientific International Commercial, had first been announced by Ogden at the beginning of 1928. It was a much reduced form of English in terms of vocabulary. It consisted of just 850 words, and it had a relatively simplified grammar. Ogden and his collaborator, I.A. Richards, claimed that this reduced, orderly and more efficient form of English would speed up the learning of English as a second language, would, as its name implies, facilitate international business and scientific discourse, and more grandly would act as an antidote to conflict and lead to an end of war, the end of war. Ogden's claims for BASIC make it clear that the principles on which he drew in constructing the language and the aims which he believed could be fulfilled through its use were firmly in line with the view that to approach language scientifically and rationally would lead to simplification, the reduction of the unnecessary, and an elimination of chaos and error. BASIC was indeed for Ogden a language which was, as he claimed in an article in 1929, quote, a technique for achieving control of the language machine. So this new language was based on the linguistic theories of Ogden and I.A. Richards as set out in their Meaning of Meaning from 1923. This was a hugely influential work. 10 new editions were issued in both the US and UK between 1923 and 1949, and it argued for a new linguistic science which would propagate and disseminate a new attitude to language. The Meaning of Meaning proposed a programme of what James McIlvenney, in his recent monograph on Ogden, has very nicely called referential hygiene. Ogden and Richards promoted referential hygiene because they wished in particular to clean language of its links to occult thinking, what Ogden called in the Meaning of Meaning, and continued to call it through the rest of his life, word magic. And it is this programme that led in the end to their construction of Basic English. But it's this programme too in which I'm going to argue can be seen the seeds of the collaboration between Ogden and Joyce, which seems on the surface to so undermine it. So while Basic English, based on the referential hygiene of the Meaning of Meaning, reduced and simplified its language of origin in order to make it universally usable and to reduce, in fact eliminate, the possibilities of word magic, the language of Finnegan's Wake, although recognised as also invested in the histories and ideas of language reform. In fact, Robert McCalman, in an article in 1929, called the language of the work in progress, quote, an Esperanto of the unconscious. This language was for most readers unreadable. But what makes the collaboration between Ogden and Joyce even more strange is that the difficulties of reading Joyce's language were associated by both supporters and critics through the late 1920s and into the 30s with magic and the occult. The poet John Rodker, attempting to justify the obfuscations of the work in progress in 1928, wrote that, this is John Rodker, he wrote that the dynamic aspect of the work derives in a large part of its importance from the fact that words are used, so to speak, in vacuo, by means of which they still preserve much of their ancient magic. The words of Finnegan's Wake are magical then, in that they do not refer to what is in the world, but rather they have been, in the words of Eisenstein, Sergei Eisenstein in 1939, writing about Finnegan's Wake, in it he said, words have been turned into abracadabra. So not referential, but a kind of spell. Basic then is rationalising, simplifying and popular, while Joyce's experiment results in an expanded esoteric language which only makes sense to initiates, and at the heart of the characterisations of each language is the question of reference. The referential hygiene of Basic consists, as I'll go on to show, in its attempts to eliminate non-referential language, and the difficulty of Joyce's language inhered in its refusal to be referential. But as I will show, Ogden's championing of the direct reference of Basic as a solution to the problem of language led, in the end, to his return to non-referential language, and, I think, begins to explain his collaboration with Joyce. Of course, the aims of reducing conflict and facilitating increased understanding as a part of a modernising project had been common to late 19th century language reform movements, which were, however, often friendly to a range of beliefs which went beyond the orthodoxies of contemporary science. Esperanto, the universal language invented in the 1880s, for example, attracted scientists, spiritualists and psychical researchers. Basic English, though, while reformist, differed from the late 19th century constructed languages in that underlying it is the sense not just that multiple languages interfered with clear communication, but that language as such was a problem. So it wasn't just that there were lots of languages, it was that language itself is problematic. Ogden was steep in the linguistic turn of the early 20th century. He was close to Bertrand Russell, or he thought he was, for example, and he facilitated the publication of Wittgenstein's Tractatus in English in 1922. And at the heart of the problem of language as such for Ogden was its continuing links to occult thinking. This, and the need for referential hygiene, can be seen in an article jointly authored by Ogden and Richards in Psyche in 1921. The article was written early in their collaboration, and it sets out to explain to the general reader the basics of the new science of psychology. It's motivated by the belief, repeated more generally in the meaning of meaning and in the invention of basic English, that different ideas and the conflicts they generate are at bottom a problem of language. What Ogden and Richards call apparent differences among different theories, they claim in fact, quote, may be due merely to the language in which they are stated. First Steps in Psychology, as the article was called, begins by acknowledging that every general reader was by now acquainted with many of the ideas of psychology, but that the danger with this is that in their words, quote, hard to know how to sort the mysticism from the meat. What is dangerous for them is an approach to language which is made up of ephemeral abstractions, and what is required are words which refer directly to real things in the world. From the beginning, then, reference is the key for them in their struggle with language. Through the 1920s, Ogden and Richards developed basic English in order to achieve the language of meat and to defeat the language of mysticism. Basic English consists in a vocabulary of 850 words, as I've said, a number which Ogden proudly showed could fit onto the back of a sheet of newspaper. And this is proof that it can, this is proof that it can fit onto a sheet of notepaper. And this is all of the words of basic English, 850 words, and this list of words was included in all of the publications that Ogden either wrote himself or oversaw in the late 20s and 30s about basic English. And you can't really read the words there, but I have a copy of this here, so you can look for the words which are missing afterwards. And it also appeared in a series that Ogden edited for Routledge and Kegan Paul, Psyche Miniatures, in which I.A. Richards' Science and Poetry appeared. And this list is at the beginning of Science and Poetry. The reduction of English from the 20 to 30,000 word vocabulary of the general reader to this 850 is made possible by eliminating verbs and by putting at its centre a limited number of nouns which are predominantly pictorial and which are key to ensuring the meat over the mysticism. What is eliminated in this reduction, in other words, is the figurative in language. It is this elimination that constitutes the referential hygiene of basic. Indeed, one of the 6 canons set out in the meaning of meaning in order to ensure this hygiene is given by Ogden and Richards as follows. A symbol or a word refers to what it is actually used to refer to. It refers to what it refers to and nothing else. For Ogden, then, basic was not just about providing a new international language which could bring harmony and understanding in a way that national languages couldn't. It was more importantly a cure for the problem of language as such. And it's in the meaning of meaning that we can see clearly the link Ogden's need to eliminate figurative language in basic English, the link between that and occult thinking. In the meaning of meaning, Ogden and Richards established a theory of signs which they believed would help cure the ills of contemporary language use, the central ill of which, they argue, is the misuse of abstract concepts, the assumption, that is, that the existence of a word means that such a thing exists in the world. Such belief leads to what they call phantoms, words which are due only to, quote, the refractive power of the linguistic medium, and which they argue, quote, must not be treated as part of the furniture of the universe. So the tendency of language to change the direction of its meaning, its refractiveness, is key to the problem of language as such. That this is the basis of their aim for referential language can be seen in the famous diagram which they give near the beginning of the meaning of meaning. This one. This is their diagrammatic way of showing the elements of every statement in language. And each statement for them is made up of the referent, the symbol, and the thought or the reference. And word magic consists of believing that there's a direct relationship between the symbol or word in this case and the thing to which it refers. But for them, the only relationship between those two is mediated through thought. And it's this which they believe leads to the kind of occult or magical nature of language, or the supposed occult or magical nature of language. So if all language consists in a triangular relation between a thought, a word and a referent, for Ogden and Richards, problems with language arise in the supposition of a direct relation between word and referent. As is hinted by their use of the term phantom, the belief in words which claim existence for the non-existent is for Ogden the basis of word magic. At the beginning of the long second chapter of the book, which is entitled The Power of Words, Ogden warns that from the earliest times, the symbols which men have used to aid the process of thinking and to record their achievements have been a continuous sort of wonder and illusion. The whole human race has been so impressed by the properties of words as instruments for the control of subjects that in every age it has attributed to them occult powers. Through a survey of a range of philosophers, classical writers and even scientists, as well as numerous examples of the contemporary occult, from theosophy through healing by suggestion to the theories of Jung, Ogden makes it clear that such beliefs in word magic still exist. He cites James Fraser in this chapter, the anthropologist, of course, whose The Golden Bough was so influential in British culture in the first half of the 20th century. He cites him as authority on the continued existence of word magic and magical beliefs about language. And indeed, Fraser is the authority too, of course, for the linking of magic as such with the operations of figurative language. Fraser's argument, famously in The Golden Bough, is that all magic can be understood as what he calls sympathetic magic, operating according to two laws, that of similarity or homeopathy and that of contagion or contiguity. And these have their equivalents in language as metaphor and metonymy. Figurative language creates the illusion that something exists when it doesn't. This link between figurative language and the continued existence of word magic is asserted by Ogden and Richards from the very beginning of The Meaning of Meaning. In the first chapter, they distinguish sharply between science and metaphor and see the confusion between them as having clouded the thinking of earlier writers on semantics. It is impossible, they say, to handle a scientific matter in such metaphorical terms. Word magic, the central enemy of the linguistic programme of both The Meaning of Meaning and Basic English, describes language then that is not directly referential. The furniture of the universe cannot be spoken of in metaphors because metaphors mistake the ability to create in language with actual existence. Here we can see more clearly why the collaboration between Ogden and Joyce is so strange. For Joyce, however sceptical he might have been about occult beliefs, I don't think he was, but most people do, language is a means of conjuring. It's only an invention in language that certain truths can be created and realised. Joyce makes it clear in his abracadabra language in Anna Livia Pluribel's Mamma Festa, early in Finnegan's Wake, that using a rational language for all elements of human experience reduces not just the language but the experience itself. Joyce, in this quote, which I'm not going to read because it's too long and too difficult, but in this quote where he's saying, you can't, or in Anna Livia Pluribel's voice, he's saying you can't use different types of language for different experiences. He's basically saying the language of the bedroom is not inappropriate for the language of officialdom, and indeed the language of what he calls the sesquipedalian of the panepistemion, which he means the long words of the university, are not appropriate for the bedroom. He ironically embeds the names of Basic English and another constructed language, Volapük, into this claim that different languages are needed for different kinds of experiences. At the end of this claim, though, it's not just that different languages are necessary that's asserted, it is language itself which is limiting, and only language play can push at this limit. So hath been love, 'tis, and will be. And that 'tis, I think, is Joyce's acknowledgement that language has a limit to its description, its ability to name and describe human experience, but actually that limit is not about silence, it's about language play. However, if Basic English was the attempt to make word magic impossible, to eliminate it from language, and to make language strictly referential, to allow only language that denotes the furniture of the universe, in Ogden and Richards' words, what is curious is that Ogden and Richards use figurative language themselves. In turning now to this, I think we can begin to account for Ogden's attraction to Joyce's abracadabra language in Finnegan's Wake, and also to see more generally a different relation between reformist rationalisation in language and occult thinking in the period. As we've already seen in the article from 1921 on psychology, the anxiety that runs through the later meaning of meaning and through Basic English already dominates. The article sets out clearly the way that figurative language leads to linguistic practices that 2 years later Ogden will call word magic. But what is curious is that in the article, Ogden and Richards need precisely word magic in order to do this. It is the obscuring of what is actually the case by the magical that Ogden and Richards wish to clear up in the article. But in trying to do this, what they show is language's tendency to return to the figurative and to the word magic, their language no less than the faith healers and theosophists Ogden castigates in The Meaning of Meaning. At the beginning of the article, they say they will use, quote, the simplest possible language to explain current thinking in psychology, and for them, simplicity of explanation is dependent on a strictly referential scientific language which fights word magic's tendency towards analogy and metaphor. Popular language, they say, in all matters that are connected with the mind is apt to be vague and misleading. Psychologists have, therefore, felt obliged to introduce terms freer from irrelevant associations than in ordinary use, and these often make the subject seem dry and abstract to the beginner. But if it's realised that they are only names for what must, from the nature of the case, be processes familiar to everyone as part of ordinary experience, a little patience is all that's necessary for the mastery of current opinions. The problem is, though, that once a scientific term enters ordinary language, it can lead not just to increased clarity and understanding, but indeed to misunderstanding and delusion, to word magic. Their key example of this in the article on psychology is the word unconscious, coined to increase precision, but a metaphor which for them has led to some problematic results. Most discussions of the unconscious, they say, proceed as though there were two distinct realms, the conscious and the unconscious. The mind is thus regarded as composed of separate states, and in addition to the unconscious we hear of the subconscious, the preconscious, the foreconscious and so forth. This metaphorical language is convenient for some purposes, but no clear understanding of the problems can be reached unless we are prepared to go behind such verbal devices. A correction in our understanding of what the word unconscious denotes then would lead not just to the elimination of obfuscating metaphor, but to the elimination of the occult or magical thinking with which it's so entwined. For Ogden and Richards, the unconscious, rather than being the site of the mysterious or the otherworldly, is the effect of the non-attendance of the conscious towards things that are nevertheless familiar and resolutely of the world. This model, that conscious attention eliminates occult thinking, can be seen too in the place the authors give to the occult phenomena of the period in the development of psychology as a science. At the end of the 19th century, they argue, as so often, advance in psychology was due to fresh stimulus provided by strange occurrences for which accepted theories could suggest no explanation. Hypnotism, alternating personalities, automatic writing and psychical research became the central points of interest. So the attention of science directed to those parts of life usually seen as mysterious or occulted shows them, in fact, according to Ogden and Richards, to be continuous with the laws and facts of ordinary life, meet, again, rather than mysticism. As a result, Ogden and Richards conclude, there is thus reason to expect that many phenomena for which the most desperate hypotheses have been required will be found to be explained by quite reasonable scientific assumptions. With metaphors cleared away, so too can the thought process and beliefs to which they lead, word magic, be cleared up. It is hardly necessary to point out, they say, that all this language will vanish as the science advances. If unscientific language then is responsible for word magic, for the mystification of many familiar and perfectly ordinary experiences and phenomena, and the creation of non-existent entities through the use of figurative language, Ogden and Richards acknowledge that psychology itself is not always free from such verbal devices, such as the word unconscious. And it's here, in their attempt to explain this, that we find the return of word magic, the use of language, that is, that goes beyond just the description of the furniture of the universe and enters into metaphor. Discussing the way that contemporary psychology uses metaphors of force from physics to describe the unconscious, they claim that, quote, this language will vanish, their claim that this language will vanish as the science advances is immediately followed by this. But just as the scaffolding erected by builders is often more interesting to the public than their final architectural achievements, so the psychology of desire and memory in its early stages has lent itself to a picturesque treatment which, now that its work has been done, can profitably be discarded. It's here that Ogden and Richards desire to communicate to their readers in a simple referential language of scientific precision the state and status of current psychology reaches a breaking point. Psychology can show us how metaphorical abstractions such as the unconscious actually just denote a familiar and often experienced part of normal life, but in order to do so it sometimes has to use metaphors which at some point in the future will no longer be necessary, and in order to explain how at some point metaphor will no longer be necessary, Ogden and Richards use metaphorical language. They too use word magic in order to persuade that one day word magic will not be necessary. This return to word magic is not, though, just a case of early teething problems. It can be seen too in basic English. While Ogden and Richards claimed in The Meaning of Meaning that, quote, it is extremely unlikely that any two references will ever be strictly familiar, and that as a result, as we have seen, a symbol must only refer to what it is actually used to refer to, their attempt to produce a language that acts this out leads to its undoing. Basic reduces language to a bare minimum to reduce the possibility of word magic, but in doing so it necessarily puts analogy, the similarity on which metaphor is based and which The Meaning of Meaning attempts to expel, at its heart. In his book Debabelization from 1931, Ogden argues that it is analogy that is key to Basic's reduction and its simplicity. Indeed, it's analogy that allows Basic to be the potential saviour of actual language. He says that Basic, in virtue of its restricted vocabulary, which eliminates the majority of idiomatic overgrowths, is able to profit by just those analogical regularities which the philologist has hitherto treated as a nucleus for the study of exceptions. As Sapir observes, the real point is that behind the vagaries of idiomatic usage, there are perfectly clear-cut logical relations which are only weakly brought out in the overt form of English. It is the function of Basic to focus on this nucleus, and analogy will do the rest. But as we've seen, it is the analogy of metaphor that threatens to expand symbols so that they no longer refer to what they are actually used to refer to. This problem, at the heart of Basic, leads it in the end to a language that is close to the abracadabra of Finnegan's Wake. In an editorial also entitled Debabelization, which appeared in Psyche in 1928, Ogden begins by claiming that Basic English, quote, as a simplified universal English will differ sufficiently from literary English to be almost a new language. In demonstrating both this and that Basic, though a much reduced version of English, loses nothing, Ogden sets out the following example of translating standard English with all its problematic verbal devices into Basic. Consider, he says, a sentence differing but little from those of which even philosophers are not always ashamed. So this is his example of standard English. It cannot be denied that an entity which possesses the property of existence is an existential entity. On the other hand, a negative fact has no such status in the realm of being. Do not the above propositions afford a correct statement of the solution of the ontological problem? The answer is in the affirmative. So Ogden goes on, here are 55 words, 40 of which are different. Let's see what can be done with only 4 different words. Take it, that, not, and is, and arrange them thus. That is, that is not, that it is. Here are 16 as against 55, and 4 as against 40. Now punctuate as follows. That is, that is not. Is not that it? It is. Who will contend, he says, that anything of value has been lost? This is an uncanny echo of Joyce's "'Tis" from the Manifesto of Anna Livia Plurabelle. Both Joyce's "'Tis" and Ogden's "is" are the result of an attempt to describe in the best way that language allows that unpointatable thing, that abstraction that nevertheless must be spoken, existence. And in both cases, it is repetition rather than reference that articulates its truth. Indeed, here, Ogden's repetition as a result of reduction approaches the revelation not just that some language is metaphorical, but that all language is metaphorical, and that it does not just point at particular furniture, but negotiates resemblances. A much later passage from Finnegan's Wake demonstrates precisely that the isness of existence is in the end represented in language not as meat, but as abracadabra. In the final soliloquy of Finnegan's Wake, celebrating the changing, untidy complexity of life as it is, Anna Livia Plurabelle tells us what will be is. The reductions of Basic and the expansions of Joyce's language come together in an articulation of the furniture of the universe that is necessarily an abracadabra, a spell and an incantation. The attempt to articulate in language that most basic furniture, existence itself, reveals in the writing of both Basic English and Finnegan's Wake the limits of language. But it is at this limit that language as sound, as play, as necessarily metaphorical, as indeed word magic returns. What Ogden's work finds problematic in the Power of Words chapter in The Meaning of Meaning is that language makes things exist which otherwise wouldn't, but what is, in fact, isn't. But his collaboration with Joyce reveals that during the period it was impossible in the end to practice language without the sense that language as a system of signs is not so much an opposition to, but conceals within itself language's magic.